In a field in Essex, there is a barn. It is 125 feet long and 46 feet wide, and the oak posts holding up the roof are thicker than the man who cut them. Stand underneath it, and the space above your head opens out like the inside of an overturned ship. The timber was felled around the year 1220. The joints were cut by carpenters who never used a single nail, and 700 years later, the joints are still holding. Farmers were still storing grain in it within living memory. It is the oldest thing the Knights Templar left standing in England. Not a sword, not a vault, a barn. For 7 centuries, people have dug up half of Europe looking for Templar gold. They have searched islands off Nova Scotia. They have x-rayed chapel floors in Scotland. They have written a shelf of books about a treasure fleet that sailed out of La Rochelle and vanished. They were standing in the wrong building. The Templar fortune was never buried. It was planted, grazed, milled, shipped, and lent out at a fee, and an enormous share of it passed through barns exactly like this one, in counties nobody has ever bothered to dig up. But a barn that size is the end of a long story, not the beginning of one. To understand why an order of warrior monks needed the largest grain store in the county, you have to go back to the year 9 men swore an oath that they would own nothing at all. This is what the poor knights of the Temple of Solomon actually looked like from the inside. The account book, not the legend. So let's build the order from nothing, put you in charge of one of its houses, and follow every coin in and out the gate. Because the most valuable thing the Templars ever owned was not the treasure everyone spent 700 years looking for. Start with the vow, because the vow is the business model. A Templar brother owned nothing. No property, no money, no horse of his own, not even the mantle on his back. He handed over everything he had on the day he joined, and he never got it back. The order, however, owned everything. That gap between the man who owns nothing and the institution that owns him and all his possessions is the whole machine. Every gift a brother brought in stayed in. Nothing ever left through inheritance, because a man with no property has nothing to leave. Nobody's widow ever sued. Nobody's second son ever demanded his share. You are looking at something that behaves like a corporation roughly 2 centuries before anyone had the word for it. It doesn't age, it doesn't die, it just accumulates. Then, in 1139, the Pope handed it the second half. A papal privilege exempted the order from local taxes. It exempted them from the authority of local bishops. It made them answerable to the Pope in Rome, and to nobody else on the continent. Read that as a businessman rather than a historian, and you get something startling. A tax-exempt multinational operating in a dozen kingdoms with no local regulator anywhere. And the donations came in fast. By 1185, when the English master ordered a full survey of what the order held, Lincolnshire alone accounted for more than 17,000 acres, 20 mills, income from 18 churches. 17,000 acres is about 27 square miles, 1 county, 1 order, 50 years, and every acre of it arrived as a gift. Nobody bought any of it. Which sounds like the finest business in Europe, right up until you ask what a gift actually costs to keep. Free land is the most expensive thing anyone can hand you. When a knight donated to the order, he was rarely donating an estate. He was donating a field, a mill share, 2 strips in a common, a meadow beside a river that flooded. The 1185 survey shows exactly this pattern across Lincolnshire. The vast majority of parcels smaller than 100 acres, scattered across 5 preceptories, most of them low in value. You have not been given a farm, you have been given a filing problem with mud on it. So the first money the order ever spends is money nobody sings about. Lawyers, effectively. Men who ride out to establish what the boundary actually is when the neighboring lord disagrees. Surveyors, cartage, and drainage endlessly. At Templehurst in Yorkshire, sitting in flood country, the accounts show generations of work on drains and water management before that land produced anything worth counting. Consolidation is the entire early game. 100 scattered parcels earn you very little. The same 100 parcels, traded and swapped and bought into a single block, earn you a farm. And a farm needs somewhere to put the harvest, building the house. You cannot bank grain in a puddle. So you build a preceptory, the hall where the brothers eat and sleep, a chapel, a granary, fish ponds for the days meat is forbidden, a moat, and then the expensive part, the barns. At Cressing in Essex, the order builds 2 of them, 50 years apart. The first, the barley barn, goes up somewhere between 1205 and 1235. The second, the wheat barn, between 1257 and 1280. Price that out in the only currency that matters here, which is oak. A barn on that scale eats a small forest. Not young trees either. You need mature oak, straight, and you need dozens of them. And each one has to be felled, hauled by ox cart over roads that turn to soup in November, then squared and jointed on site by carpenters skilled enough that their work is still standing after 700 winters. That is a multi-year capital project, and it produces nothing. It doesn't grow anything. It doesn't sell anything. It is a box you build so that the thing you grow doesn't rot before you can sell it at the price you want. Which is the real point of it. A barn is not storage. A barn is the ability to refuse the first offer. Sell your grain at harvest when every farm in Essex is selling grain, and you take the worst price of the year. Hold it until spring, when the granaries are empty and the towns are hungry, and the same sack is worth substantially more. The barn is what lets you wait, but it also means your wealth is now sitting in a wooden building in a field, which is the problem with everything you've built so far. The men. Almost nobody in a Templar house was a knight. This is the detail that quietly dismantles the entire image. Picture the order and you picture white mantles and red crosses, men in mail. But a preceptory in Essex or Lincolnshire was a farm, and farms are run by farmhands. The clearest surviving snapshot comes from Cressing in 1335, and I want to be honest about what that record is, because it's not a Templar document. By then the estate had passed to the Knights Hospitaller, so this is the next owner's inventory. But it's the closest look we have at the working shape of the place, and the shape is telling. 600 sheep, 32 cattle, and a staff list of a steward, 5 chaplains, 2 pages, 3 servants, and 2 lads. 1 steward, 5 chaplains, and no knights on the list at all. The knights were the marketing. The payroll was shepherds. And that inversion runs through the whole institution. The fighting men were in Outremer, the Crusader states in the Holy Land, where they consumed money at a rate no farm could match. War horses, mail, castles, garrisons, shipping. Everything the Essex barn earned existed to be spent 2,000 miles away by men the Essex farmhands would never meet. You are not running a business. You are running a remittance operation with a chapel attached. The sheep. Which brings you to the animal that did more for the order than any of its soldiers. English wool in the 13th century was the finest in Europe, and Flemish and Italian weavers would pay almost anything for it. A monastery with good pasture wasn't running a farm. It was running an export business with a guaranteed foreign buyer. The Templars were very good at this. By the time their English estates were seized, the order's landholdings amounted to the single largest estate in the country, and they were among its most important producers of wool and dairy. And they had 2 advantages nobody else had. The first was the royal grant. Kings gave the order the right to hold weekly markets and annual fairs on their own land. That means you are no longer a farmer taking your goods to somebody else's market and paying somebody else's fees. You are the market. Everyone who trades there pays you for the privilege. The second was the mill. 20 of them in Lincolnshire alone by 1185, and fulling mills at Barton by the same year. Fulling is the pounding stage of turning raw wool into finished cloth. Own the mill and you don't just sell the wool, you take a cut of what happens to it next. The ships. And then there is the part of the operation that gets remembered for entirely the wrong reason. The Templars owned ships. This is the detail that later got spun into the vanishing treasure fleet, and the ordinary version is more interesting than the legend because the ordinary version is a freight business. Every year, the order had to move men, horses, grain, weapons, and cash from Europe to the Crusader states. Doing that on somebody else's ships means paying somebody else's prices at the exact moment of year when every other Crusader is also trying to book passage. So they bought their own hulls. And a hull that carries your own cargo one way is an empty hull coming back. So they filled it. They carried other people's goods. They rented space to merchants and pilgrims. They exported wine and horses. At Castle Pilgrim, on the coast of what is now northern Israel, they ran a salting mill, distilling seawater into salt, a commodity that everything from food preservation to glassmaking depended on. Look at the shape of that. A military order builds a supply line for a war, then discovers the supply line is a business, then runs the business to fund the war. Every capability they built for one purpose got sold to somebody else the moment it had spare capacity. That is the pattern of the entire institution, and it explains what happens next. So add it all up. 27 square miles in one county. Mills, markets, ships, the best wool in Europe. Barns big enough to hold the harvest until the price is right. The number is enormous, and almost none of it was yours to spend. Every surplus had one destination, and the destination was a war that had been losing money for a century. That is the thing about the Templars that gets missed. On paper, they were the richest institution in Europe outside the church itself. In practice, they were permanently short of cash because everything they owned was land, and land does not move, and the war was somewhere else. They needed a business that produced money rather than crops. They found one by accident. So far, this is a farm with a chapel attached. Here is where it becomes a bank. It starts with a practical problem that had nothing to do with money. A pilgrim wants to reach Jerusalem. The journey takes months and crosses a dozen jurisdictions, and every mile of it is worked by people who make their living from travelers who carry their savings on their body. Carrying coin is how you get killed. Not carrying coin is how you starve. The Templars solved it, and the solution turned out to be worth more than every acre they owned. You walk into the temple in London, you hand over your money, you receive a sealed document. You travel to the Holy Land carrying nothing worth stealing. You present the document at the temple in Acre, and you receive your money back, minus the order's commission. That's a letter of credit. Not the first in human history. Italian merchants and others were doing versions of this, but nobody else on earth had the thing that made it work at scale: branches. Because that is what a preceptory actually is. Every one of those farms in Essex and Lincolnshire and Aquitaine and Aragon was also a fortified building, staffed by men under discipline, holding cash, connected by an internal courier network running from Scotland to Jerusalem. The order had accidentally built the first international branch banking network in Europe, and they had built it out of barns. And here is the master loop closing. The most valuable thing the Templars ever owned was never the treasure. It was the network that made carrying treasure unnecessary. Once that exists, everything else follows fast. Safe deposit. Their houses had thick walls, armed men, and a legal status that put them outside every local lord's reach. Rob one, and you weren't just committing a crime, you were stealing from the Pope and getting blacklisted from the only financial network on the continent. King John of England kept the crown jewels in the London Temple. When your safety deposit box holds the crown of England, the reputation sells itself. Currency exchange. They ran exchange offices in Jerusalem and the ports of the Crusader states, where every arriving pilgrim needed local coin, and every merchant needed to settle across 3 currencies. They charged for it. Lending to kings. This is where the money gets serious. Louis VII of France borrowed so heavily to fund his crusade that contemporaries described the order as having been brought near ruin by it. King John borrowed 9 marks of gold when his excommunication was lifted, then 2,100 marks shortly before he signed Magna Carta, then 2,000 more later the same year to pay his soldiers in Poitou and Gascony. 2,100 marks is roughly 330,000 silver pennies. An unskilled laborer in England at that time earned somewhere around a penny to a penny halfpenny a day. So the king borrowed in a single transaction something on the order of 600 years of one working man's wages. Managing the money itself. Henry II of England deposited royal taxes in London and drew the funds in France. Philip II of France put significant royal revenue under Templar management. When Henry II owed penance for the murder of Thomas Becket, the crown handed the Templars the job of collecting the Saladin tithe, a 10% levy on movable goods across the realm. They had become the tax collector, the treasury, and the creditor of the same government, simultaneously. Debt collection for other lenders. In 1252, an abbot at St. Albans, owing money to an Italian merchant, was instructed to make his repayments to the London Temple. The order wasn't even a party to that loan. They were the clearinghouse. 5 streams: land, deposits, exchange, lending, administration. And every one of them ran through the same door. Not a vault door, a reputation. Reputations have exactly one lock. Which raises the obvious problem. Lending money at interest was usury. Usury was a mortal sin. The church that protected the Templars, exempted them from tax, and made them answerable to nobody else was the same church that classified their most profitable activity as a sin serious enough to damn a man. So they didn't charge interest, they charged handling fees, management charges, custody fees, exchange commissions, typically modest, in the range of 1 to 2%. And where a loan needed a return, they structured it against future earnings instead. A noble borrows, and the order takes its repayment out of the rents and income of his own estate until the debt clears. Same economics, different noun. This is worth being precise about because it's the mechanism that let a religious order become a lender in the first place. The prohibition was on interest, meaning a named charge on a loan. It was not a prohibition on being paid for services, and the Templars were, technically and defensively, providing a great many services: storage, transport, conversion, administration. Whether that was a genuine legal distinction or a sophisticated dodge is a question people were arguing about at the time and are still arguing about now. What isn't in question is that it worked for nearly 200 years. But the papal privilege that made all of this possible had a cost, and the cost was invisible until the day it mattered. Being exempt from every local authority means having no local ally. The order answered only to the Pope. not to the King of France, not to the Bishop of Paris, not to any court or parliament or noble house that might one day have owed them a favor. In good weather, that is total freedom. It means nobody can tax you, sue you, or command you. It also means that when the Pope stops protecting you, there is no second door. And remember what all 5 income streams ran through. Not one of them was a thing you could lock in a chest. The land could be seized. The deposits belonged to other people. The loans were promises. The whole structure rested on the belief that the Templars were untouchable. And belief is not an asset you can defend with a wall. They had already been shown this once. During the Barons' War, Prince Edward, the future Edward I, walked into the London Temple, broke open the strongboxes, and took £10,000 that belonged to other people's deposits. The bank was robbed by the heir to the throne and stayed in business. They should have read that more carefully than they did. By 1307, this looks unbreakable. It broke in a single morning. The man who broke it was Philip IV of France, and the first thing to understand about Philip is that he was broke. Not metaphorically. He had debased the French coinage so aggressively, repeatedly cutting the silver content of the money, that Paris rioted over it in 1306. The second thing to understand is that the Templars were not his first attempt at a solution. He had already expelled the Jewish moneylenders of France and seized their assets. He had already gone after the Lombard bankers and taken theirs. He had taxed the clergy so hard it triggered open war with Pope Boniface VIII, ending with the king's men physically assaulting the Pope at Anagni in 1303. By the time he turned to the Templars, this was his 3rd strike against a creditor class, and he had the procedure down. That pattern, the serial confiscation of everyone he owed, is the strongest evidence historians have for what the arrests were actually about, because no surviving document says the quiet part. Nobody wrote down, "I did this for the money." What we have is this: he owed the order an enormous amount. He kept everything they had. And the man who ran the entire prosecution was Guillaume de Nogaret, his keeper of the seals, the same minister who had gone to Anagni to seize a pope. For weeks, royal scribes copied out arrest warrants and sealed them in wax. Couriers carried them to sheriffs and bailiffs across France, with orders not to open them until the night of the 12th of October. At dawn on Friday the 13th, 1307, every one of those seals broke at the same hour, and effectively every Templar in France was dragged out of bed. Now, the part everyone thinks they know. The story says that the night before the arrests, 18 ships slipped out of La Rochelle loaded with the treasure and were never seen again. There is no good evidence for it. Alain de Merger, one of the leading modern historians of the order, finds nothing supporting a treasure fleet vanishing from La Rochelle. Malcolm Barber's account has the central treasury in Paris seized by Philip's men during the arrests. The crown moved fast and took the ships and the ports along with everything else. And when the king's officials went through the Templar houses, they found dramatically less than the legend had promised. Which is the point of this entire episode. There was no hoard. There was never a hoard. The wealth was 17,000 acres in Lincolnshire and 600 sheep in Essex, and a network of promises stretching from Scotland to Jerusalem. You cannot put that on a ship. You cannot bury it on an island. You can only seize it slowly, field by field, which is exactly what happened. In England, Edward II stripped the Templar estates of their stores, sold the livestock, and took the timber before handing anything over. In 1312, Pope Clement dissolved the order and transferred its property to the Knights Hospitaller, the Templars' direct rivals. And Philip, having controlled those estates throughout the years-long trial, presented the Hospitallers with a bill for legal fees and management expenses incurred during the process. They had to pay him a fortune to take possession of land they had been legally given. In March 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, was burned on an island in the Seine. And in 2001, a document called the Chinon Parchment surfaced in the Vatican archives, showing that Clement's own envoys had examined the leadership and absolved them of heresy back in 1308, 6 years before Molay went into the fire. So run the ledger, both directions. Take a house on the scale of Cressing, 600 sheep in the years we have account for. In a good year, a flock that size gives you something on the order of 2 sacks of wool, and a sack, as the merchants counted it, is a substantial thing, well over 300 pounds in weight. English wool of decent quality is fetching several pounds sterling a sack from the Flemish buyers. Add the grain you held back until spring, the mill taking its cut of everyone else's flour, the market rents, the dairy, and the house clears a real surplus. And you send almost all of it 2,000 miles away. Nobody in Essex ever sees a penny of profit, because profit was never the point of the arrangement. The preceptory is not a business that earns, it is a business that remits. In a bad year, a wet summer, a poor clip, murrain running through the flock, the arithmetic inverts and does not care. Your shepherds still eat, the chaplains still get paid, the roof still needs work, and the war needs money regardless, because crusading does not pause for a bad harvest in Essex. So you borrow against next year's wool. Now the barn is holding a crop you have already spent, and the finest wool in Europe belongs to somebody else before it has grown. Do that for 2 centuries across 1,000 houses, and you get an institution that looks, from outside, like the wealthiest thing in Christendom, and from inside, like a permanent cash flow emergency wearing very good armor. That was the order's structural weakness, and it had nothing to do with heresy. Enormous assets, chronically thin cash. Everything they owned was land, and land is the one asset you cannot pick up and carry when a king with a scribe comes for it. So who actually got rich? Not the Templars. They took a vow of poverty, and by every surviving indication, they meant it. A brother who spent 40 years turning Essex wool into Crusader wages died owning nothing, because that was the deal he signed. The winners were the Hospitallers, who inherited an empire they hadn't built. And Philip, who cancelled his debts, harvested the estates for 5 years, and then charged his rivals for the privilege of cleaning up after him. Could you have gotten rich as a Templar? No, that was the entire point of the vow. Could you have gotten rich owning what the Templars owned, the acres and the mills and the market rights and the deposits and the loans to kings? Enormously, ruinously. You would have been one of the wealthiest institutions in Europe, and that is precisely why you would have been arrested for it. The gold that people have spent 700 years searching for was never in a vault. Most of it went through a barn in Essex. The barn is still there. The order isn't.